He hesitated before the first sip. The spoon rattled against the tin cup as Unaritzia Karl Hoffman lifted it, the surface of the milk catching a sliver of Texas sun. 2 years, 2 long years, without tasting the real thing. Not the chalky ersatz powder that clung to the mouth and turned to paste, but cold, sweet milk that belonged to childhood kitchens and peacetime tables. He took it in, and the taste betrayed everything he had been told. The Wehrmacht had taught him that America was exhausted, decadent, diluted by democracy and softness. Yet on his tongue was proof that softness could feel like strength, that abundance could be a weapon. That night, he slid his pencil along the hidden notebook tucked under his mattress. The sentence he wrote, had a guard found it, would have won him a beating. The Americans feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its own soldiers. June 4th, 1943, Mexia, Texas. Through the mess hall windows at a brand new camp, 4 miles west of town, Hoffman watched U.S. guards eating sandwiches stacked high with meat. His mind split in two. In the Afrika Korps, he had conserved every ounce, counting out the iron ration. 300 grams of canned meat, 125 grams of rock-hard bread, and, on lucky days, whatever could be pried from captured British tins. Here, a bell rang, and the line moved forward toward a dining hall that looked like a factory devoted to comfort. Electric refrigerators humming, steam tables gleaming, industrial dishwashers swallowing trays by the hundred. Not a field kitchen with its horse-drawn goulash canone and thin soup gritted with sand, but a permanent system designed to make hot meals routine. For every 5 barracks, a mess hall, cooks, servers, metal cutlery that actually matched, good food, and enough of it to make a soldier doubt his entire map of the world. The whole town turned out to stare, surprised to see their enemies tanned and sturdy, marching down Railroad Street with a self-possession that seemed out of place for the defeated. No one in Mexia knew it yet, but breakfast would do what no leaflet, sermon, or lecture could. It would pry loose the beams of a rotten doctrine. A theory of racial hierarchy that had cost the world too much was about to meet its match in bacon grease and coffee steam. This moment had been set in motion 3 weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, with the surrender in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's successor after the Desert Fox was pulled back to Germany, laid down arms along with roughly 275,000 German and Italian troops. The Afrika Korps, which had shoved the British to the edge of Cairo and demanded respect from Montgomery himself, was suddenly on the other side of the wire. Among the captured was Obergefreiter Franz Müller, Iron Cross Second Class, pinned on a tunic, sweat-stained by Poland, France, and 2 desert summers. Decades later, his account would surface in the archives. We lived on 750 grams of bread, 150 grams of fat, 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish when it came. Too often there was nothing. Too often we endured on dates and luck. The first shock arrived not with a rifle butt, but with a loaf. In the collection cages around Tunis, as 20 and 30,000 prisoners sat waiting for ships, American logistics went to work. They processed men the way they processed materiel, fast, orderly, indifferent to bottlenecks. The U.S. Army ushered thousands through every day, issuing numbers, moving columns, and, this mattered most, handing out meals. Feldwebel Hans Kleine of the 15th Panzer Division later wrote to his wife from Camp McCain, Mississippi, "They gave us white bread with our meals, white bread. In Africa, when we had anything like bread, it was hard, dark crackers. The guards ate more bread in one sitting than my squad saw in a week. The ships that ferried them west were part of the shock. Liberty ships, those boxy monuments to speed and repetition, were rolling off the ways at 3 per day in the peak months. On their outbound leg, they had carried steel and food and shells across U-boat waters. On the return, the holds would have been empty but for the prisoners. Instead of a cattle pen, the Germans found space reconfigured for humans, vents pushing real air, working lights, latrines that didn't make men animals. In July 1943, the ocean interrupted their beliefs again. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer kept a food diary and letters that survived long after the camps were torn down. Breakfast, oatmeal with sugar and milk, white bread with butter, coffee with cream, for officers at home, perhaps. For ordinary soldiers, never. Yet, even as prisoners, they were served this as if it were normal. Becker's pen stumbled at a single word that felt obscene in wartime: ice cream. The merchant sailors ate steak and eggs, fresh vegetables, desserts cold enough to bite the teeth. Ice cream was a privilege in Germany, reserved for the high and the well-connected. Here, it sweated in bowls in a ship's galley. Lieutenant Heinrich Wöber, from a Prussian family that kept war like a family trade since Frederick the Great, watched a deckhand toss barely touched plates over the side as they neared the American coast. He thought of the men he'd led in Africa, thankful for a handful of dates and a mouthful of brackish water, and felt the edges of his world begin to curl up and peel away. They had not just fought an enemy, they had fought a civilization larger than their imagination. August 6, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The first meal on American soil took what remained of certain fantasies and broke them at the table. The Pullman cars that drew them inland were padded with comforts, clean windows, springs that softened the rail, an ease that felt decadent to men who had ridden to battle on steel and dust. Yet all of that was prelude to a tray at a processing station: fried chicken, mashed potatoes collapsing under gravy, green beans with a snap, cornbread warm enough to breathe steam, apple pie that smelled like the inside of a dream, coffee sweetened with real sugar. Johann Fischer, a baker's son from Munich, did the math in his head and decided that one meal contained more meat than his family could afford in a month. Americans apologized for its simplicity, explaining they had not expected the train. Fischer wrote with a clarity that hurt. They apologized for serving what our generals would have called a feast. That was the moment the lie unraveled. The trains rolled south and west, Virginia into North Carolina, Tennessee into Arkansas, and the Germans pressed their foreheads to the glass. The landscape didn't fit the pamphlets. At each stop, trackmen and porters bit into thick sandwiches, cracked bottle caps off Coca-Cola, lit cigarettes as if rationing were a rumor. At Memphis, the dining car took on supplies: sides of beef, cases of eggs, sacks of potatoes so plentiful a man could lie back on them and not touch the car's roof, crates of greens. The day's provisions for a single train exceeded what entire units had drawn in Africa. Stabs Kriegsrichter, Rudolf Richter, an agricultural inspector from Westphalia before conscription, watched freight yards funnel an empire of food from farm to city and wrote in astonishment, "The railway moves wheat by the trainload, meat by the mile, milk in cars as cold as caves, no guards with rifles, no armored escort. Food travels here as safely as a man in his own kitchen. It goes where it pleases, like a river." September 19th, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The permanence of the camps surprised them. The United States had two goals: encourage reciprocal treatment for American prisoners abroad, and return German prisoners one day as men who had seen the practical outcomes of democracy. The mess halls were humming machines, refrigerators cycling without failure, automatic washers devouring plates, steam tables keeping second helpings hot for the late shift, giant mixers turning flour and water into bread every morning. The Geneva Convention, another piece of paper the Nazi regime liked to step over, was taken seriously here. The rule was simple: prisoners were to be fed, clothed, and treated medically at the level of their captors. At Camp Swift, Hoffman found himself assigned to kitchen duty. The ledger book taught him a new arithmetic. On September 23rd, he wrote, "We threw away 300 pounds of food today, not rotten, surplus. Regulations require overproduction by 10% to ensure full portions at every line. What remains is hauled off." On the wall, a ration chart bordered on fiction: 3/4 of a pound of meat per day, 1 pound of potatoes, 1/2 pound of vegetables, 3/4 of a pound of bread, sugar, coffee, milk, butter, eggs. Farmers who hired prisoner labor paid 45 cents per hour per head to offset the program's cost. The system was procedural, boring, relentless, and that made it trustworthy. Clean, writing from Camp McCain, turned breakfasts and lunches into evidence. Oatmeal or corn flakes, milk sweetened thick, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, coffee with cream for breakfast. Noon came with meat, always meat, vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, and something sweet. Supper offered more of the same, plus soup, plus coffee. Sundays were a celebration. chicken or turkey with the trimmings, a smell that pulled men back across oceans and years to family tables. Numbers gathered around these memories like footnotes. German civilian rations had slid to around 278 calories in 1942-43, then down near 1,081 in 1943-44. Under the swastika, the math of appetite was a slow subtraction. Meanwhile, behind the wire in America, Germans ate over 3,000 calories a day. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, the top echelon lived in conditions that felt like parody. 25 generals, including von Arnim, had a house. Von Arnim had a car and driver. They had cooks who could fill requests: steaks, roast chickens, fresh fish, vegetables that had not seen a ration card since 1940. Enlisted men did not eat like that, but even their plates were beyond any reasonable expectation. From Camp Shelby, Miller wrote home, lunch was fried catfish from a river I cannot pronounce, coleslaw, hush puppies, green beans, peach cobbler. He underlined a line twice. The black soldiers who serve us eat the same food. Our newspapers said America starved its Negroes. Another lie eaten and digested. By October 1943, when German prisoners were being sent in large numbers to help on American farms, the lesson turned practical. In Texas, from 1943 through the war's end in 1945, prisoners picked fruit, harvested rice, cut timber, baled hay, threshed grain, gathered pecans. Outside Huntsville, Ernst Wagner watched a dairy farmer tip hundreds of gallons of milk onto the ground because the plant couldn't take more. The milk watered pasture like rain. German mothers would have wept to cook with those gallons, Wagner wrote. The farmer shrugged. Too much milk drops the price. It was an explanation from a different universe. Nebraska's camps held roughly 12,000 prisoners. The men worked across from farms, piling hay, and bending hard over sugar beet rows. Paul Schmidt wrote of chickens that ate grain with no ledger keeping count, barn cats that got fresh milk, dogs that gnawed scraps meaty enough to feed a family back home for days. Many farmers, when they brought prisoners into their barns and fields, invited them into their kitchens as well. Guards sat at the door, but the table was shared. Those meals were the quietest wrecking ball: plates of fried chicken, bowls of mashed potatoes slicked with butter, green beans cooked slow with ham, corn on the cob shining from butter, biscuits and gravy so rich a man had to pause, pie after pie, pitchers of cold milk sweating on the cloth, and coffee forever poured. Christmas 1943 arrived, and with it a menu that read like fiction. At Camp Hearn, the list ran long: roast turkey with stuffing, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with giblet gravy, candied yams, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, rolls and butter, mince pie, pumpkin pie, apple pie crowned with ice cream, coffee, milk, cider. From Camp McCain, Clean confessed, we ate until we were sick, not from spoilage, there was none, but from quantity. Our stomachs had been trained by scarcity to fear plenty. Men chewed and cried, thinking about kitchens back home that made do with potatoes and substitutes. In German camps, the ration for a prisoner was a predictable sadness: 9 pounds of potatoes a week, 5 pounds of bread, 2.5 pounds of cabbage, little margarine, make-believe coffee brewed from acorns. In America, men who had worn the same uniform as the regime that started the war were being fed like sons. March 1944 found the camps vivid with color: lettuce crisp in the mornings, tomatoes tight and red, cucumbers, radishes, carrots, celery, oranges as common as canteens, grapefruit that puckered the mouth, bananas with their alien sweetness, strawberries in their appointed season. In the bakeries, ovens yawned before dawn and breathed all day. White bread, whole wheat, rye. When the bakers felt like it, they made pastries and cakes for birthdays or saints' days, cookies to mark a holiday. Fisher, the baker's boy, was posted to the Camp Swift bakery and wrote with awe, 500 loaves, daily, for our compound alone. The sugar for one day of desserts outstrips what a German bakery would see in months. Summer 1944 brought a thunderclap from France. June 6th, the beaches at Normandy alive, with men and metal, and a new understanding behind the wire. Germany now fought on 3 fronts. The line wobbled in the east. The Allies had landed in the west. The Mediterranean still burned. The The skies were as hostile as the ground. Yet inside American camps the menu scarcely noticed. If anything, the harvest strengthened it. Prisoners working the fields where sugar beets grew realized a brutal ratio. One American county produced what several German provinces could not. In an Arkansas cannery, tons of peaches, perfectly edible, were rejected for a bruise. At Fort Lewis, Washington, a different group of Germans traced a story with their tongues. G.A. Gry arrived in August after being captured in Normandy. He stood outside the canteen thinking too long about a choice that would have sounded ridiculous the year before. Ice cream first or a Coca-Cola. He bought both. He would later write that he understood then the luck of his capture by America and not the Soviet Union. By September 1944, their bodies had changed. 20 pounds, 30 pounds, faces filled out, hands stopped shaking, teeth improved on regular milk, bones steadied with protein. A German doctor, Friedrich Bauer, imprisoned at Camp Shelby, ran clinic exams and wrote like a man forced to admit the obvious. They arrived malnourished, some with scurvy and pellagra. After a year, they are healthier than they have ever been. It was an embarrassing kind of miracle. At dinner tables, Becker confessed that the talk of victory had drained out of conversation. How do you defeat a nation that feeds prisoners generously while waging war in every direction? He wrote. The question didn't need an answer. December 1944, while the Ardennes exploded in Germany's last gamble and snow swallowed men whole, the Christmas dinner in American camps was, impossibly, even bigger than the year before. Turkey, ham, roast beef, all the classic sides, fruitcakes shipped from stateside bakeries, candy canes, chocolate, the real stuff, not the turnip-based imitation that had become a sad joke back home. Nuts, fresh fruit. At Camp Clinton, Italian prisoners who had switched sides after Italy's surrender were allowed to cook for the holiday. Pasta slicked with olive oil, real cheese grated thick, white flour dredged without the old calculations of what must be saved for next week. The Germans watched their former allies stir pots like men who had learned a new future. May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The guns finally fell quiet, but the revelations kept coming. German prisoners learned that American civilians had never known the kind of hunger that turns a face narrow and the eyes to coal. Rationing had pinched, meat limited, sugar checked, coffee measured, but no city starved. The farms were too many and too fertile, the rails too thick, the factories too disciplined. In May, to answer civilian complaints that prisoners were eating too well, the office of the Provost Marshal General cut available food and stopped canteens from selling treats. Even then, German prisoners still ate more and better than many German civilians would for years after surrender. At the end, the numbers settled like verdicts. The average German prisoner in America consumed roughly 3,200 calories per day. In theory, German soldiers at the front were allotted 3,600 calories. In practice, supply trains starved on roads bombed to gravel. By 1945, German civilians tried to survive on a horrifying figure. About 1,412 calories a day. American camps issued about 3/4 of a pound of meat per prisoner daily. German weekly military ration, when available, might include 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish. These weren't mere statistics. They were a liturgy that replaced an old religion. Summer 1945 brought a new kind of homesickness. Men who had fought the United States begged to stay. They had seen barns fuller than warehouses in Saxony, grain moving without escorts, water that ran hot from taps, heat that turned on with a dial, and, most of all, tables set like a promise. Hans Voecker, at Fort Robinson in Nebraska, tried to explain later. Life here was an improvement over our poor apartments with cold water and a coal stove that never quite warmed the room. The re-education worked best where the sermons never reached, at supper. Every good meal was an argument. Every full stomach contradicted a decade of indoctrination. Some who had studied agriculture before the war turned into evangelists when they returned. Hans Müller, once at Camp Shelby, took American farming practices back to Bavaria, and within 5 years, his yields rose nearly 40%. Wilhelm Fischer from Camp McCain helped sketch distribution networks in the new West Germany that looked a lot like what he had watched Americans do with freight cars and schedules instead of slogans. Dr. Bauer pushed for nutritional standards modeled on what he had seen inside a barbed wire America. Between 1945 and 1946, the United States repatriated 371,683 German prisoners of war. They went back to cities flattened into maps and fields stitched with craters. About 5,000 later immigrated to America, and many more would have come if doors had been wider. They weren't just chasing jobs, they wanted the security of knowing dinner was certain. October 1947, Fort Lewis, Washington. Among the last to go home was Grille, 3 years older than when he had arrived and decades older in what he knew. He did return, years later, as a businessman, and never forgot the noon he stood outside a canteen, choosing between ice cream and Coke. "We were always treated fairly," he wrote much later. "Enough food, 80 cents a day in pay. We could buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, Coca-Cola. My mother and sister could only dream of those things in Germany." 4 decades passed. 1985, Austin, Texas, the 40th anniversary reunion of German POWs. More than 500 returned with children and grandchildren, a parade of accents and memories moving through American airports with unembarrassed emotion. Hoffman, 78 years old and a U.S. citizen since 1955, stood behind a podium and told a truth that felt almost impolite to say aloud. "We came as soldiers of the Third Reich, sure of our superiority and of American weakness. We left as witnesses. America's power came from fields and factories, not myths about blood. They fed us, the enemy, better than Hitler fed us, his soldiers. The waste we saw wasn't cruelty. It was overflow. A nation that can feed its enemies has won the only victory that matters." He paused and then added the line that summed the journey. "Strength grows from making, not breaking." The applause rolled like a storm. Former enemies looked at one another as fellow travelers on the strangest road a man can walk, from hate to gratitude. The transformation had begun on a summer morning in 1943 when hungry men stepped into a mess hall and found a different reality than the one they had been promised. Years later, historians would try to pin it all down with careful categories. The Marshall Plan, denazification, NATO, the Cold War threat that pushed West Germans toward the democratic West. Those forces mattered, but they sometimes missed a quieter, stubbornly human factor. The 370,000 men who returned with a memory in their mouths. They had lived inside the system they had been told to despise and found it superior in ways that mattered to a family sitting down to eat. They became emissaries not because anyone trained them, but because they could not forget breakfast. Arnold Kramer, the leading scholar of German POWs in America, once summarized it like a prosecutor reading the facts. America did not win hearts with posters. It won with running water, lights that clicked on without prayer, toilets that worked, and meals that landed on tables every day. The prisoners were converted by the texture of prosperity, by what could be seen, touched, tasted. The ledger of the camps ends with lines that are easy to recite and hard to absorb. Roughly 371,683 German prisoners were held in the United States. They performed about 14 million man-days of agricultural labor. Fewer than 1% attempted escape. The greater truth can't be captured by a statistic. Men arrived believing in a story about strength drawn from cruelty. They left holding a better story. That strength drawn from generosity outlasts any victory on a map. By 1946, the last transports pulled away. On the docks and in the holds and on the trains that carried them toward the ruins of their youth, men spoke softly about dinners they had eaten on the wrong side of the fence. They took home recipes and habits. They wrote letters to farmers who had set an extra place. They taught their children that a full pantry was not decadence, but civic virtue. In town halls and co-ops and ministries, they argued for the machinery, the rail cars, the cold storage, the fertilizer, the roads, systems that made sure hunger would never again be the policy of fate. And in a final coda that belongs to one man, but feels like it could be the signature on a nation's change, an elderly former prisoner returned to Fort Lewis in 2017. He was 91 and rode a bicycle across the base with a handmade sign. USA, the country and its people, you are my first and final love. He stopped to rest, and the deputy garrison commander shook his hand and said what needed saying. How you treat somebody defines who we are. Don't forget it. The camps left almost nothing behind on the land. Buildings sold, dismantled, or folded into other uses. Fences gone, fields retaken by crops. But they left something in people that could not be undone. A generation of Germans, husbands, fathers, uncles, neighbors, returned alive because they had been captured by a country that believed feeding an enemy was not a contradiction, but a responsibility. Those men became the early advocates for a democratic prosperity that did not humiliate the poor. When the Marshall Plan poured food and machinery into a starving continent, they nodded. They had already seen the blueprint in a Texas mess hall. They helped persuade their communities that cooperation could build what conquest never could. They replaced a politics of scarcity with a politics of plenty. Food in those years was not merely fuel, it was proof. It showed that a democratic machine could run without eating its own. It revealed a nation's character in the way a family reveals itself at dinner. What it shares, what it hoards, who gets served first, who gets seconds. For the men captured in 1943, a tray heavy with eggs and bacon and buttered bread did what no argument ever had. It told them, without speeches, that their old world was over. They had come prepared for cages, cruelty, and guilt. They found rules and routines and a relentless, unromantic kindness. They wrote home about ice cream and Coca-Cola, not because brand names matter, but because those treats were a language of care they had not expected to speak. They bought candy bars with the 80 cents a day they earned. They gained weight and lost illusions. They stopped discussing victory and started discussing machinery, rail schedules, crop rotation, electric pumps, refrigerated cars, how a people feeds itself even in war. They learned that when power rests on production instead of myth, it doesn't need to shout. It can afford to feed its enemies. The Afrika Korps marched into captivity thinking they knew the map. In Tunis they saw white bread. On the Atlantic they tasted cream. At Norfolk they ate fried chicken. In Texas they threw out surplus. In Mississippi they spooned peach cobbler after catfish. On farms they watched milk run into the earth because there was more than markets could take. At Christmas they filled their plates to pain and cried for home. In spring they bit into lettuce and oranges and relearned color. In summer they weighed the word lucky and decided it meant being captured by a nation that would not starve you. By autumn their cheeks rounded. By winter they knew the war was lost. By the following May they watched a world crack along the fault line between scarcity and surplus. They boarded the ships back to Europe bearing more than duffel bags. They carried a conviction that democracy, however messy, had solved the oldest challenge in human history: how to put enough food on the table, every day, for everyone. They carried a memory vivid enough to outlive the barbed wire and the barracks. A spoon, a tremor, and the taste of real milk first thing in the morning in a country they had been taught to hate.